Welcome to Know the Love of Christ. Welcome back. Last episode, we talked about how the leaders of the Jewish religion, the chief priests, scribes, elders, Pharisees, Sadducees, questioned Jesus on his authority and tried to trap him. We saw where the Pharisees and the Herodians got all chummy together and trying to trap Jesus also. But Jesus, the way he is, as patient and skillful as he is, basically silenced them. They marveled at his answers and had stopped questioning him after that. And we ended with Jesus taking notice of a widow giving her 2 mites into the temple treasury. And we talked about how he noticed her and he knew her without saying he knew her, because he mentions how she's a widow and she's poor. And we took note of what was going on around her did not affect what she was supposed to be doing. And she was remaining faithful no matter who she was surrounded by. So that was really encouraging. Today, we're going to study chapter 13, 1 through 27. So pause here, read that chunk of scripture, and then start the podcast again. We'll get into the study. All right, so here we are. Verse 1, Jesus went out of the temple, and this is the last time. He never returns to the temple. This person asks him, it's one of his disciples, said, "See what manner of stones and what buildings are here," as if he was very proud of this, because at this time, having read Josephus again, Josephus mentions that the temple was Israel's pride and joy. It took 46 years, according to John 2:20, and some of these stones were massive. They were like 15 feet wide, and it was just a sight to behold. And this person, this disciple, is quite proud of it, and he asked Jesus, but look how Jesus answers him in verse 2. "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So these big 15-foot and larger stones, is going to be rubble, because in 70 AD, the temple, along with the rest of Jerusalem, gets destroyed. So this is a prophecy that Jesus is giving here. And it's not just a temple. Like I said, it's the whole city. There's other structures. Even the surrounding wall gets destroyed.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And not only was the Jewish nation proud of it, this was undertaken by Herod the Great. And it was still, at this time, like there were still renovations being made to it, because every Jew from all over the world contributed to it. And so from what I found in the background commentary, it said that the officials kept adding on to a golden vine. That's how much was given. They had a golden vine that was continually being, I guess, lengthened. It just said it was added to. And it was sacred to Herod's enemy as well as to his allies.
Really?
Yeah, that is how magnificent the structure was in the ancient world. That everyone, even Herod's enemies, were like,
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, Josephus says that if you mentioned you were a Jew, one of the first questions asked is about the temple. Like, ooh, that's where you worship? And
yeah.
That's amazing. I can't imagine that.
I know, it was definitely something to behold.
All right, moving on. Verse 3, Jesus goes and sits on the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the temple, with Peter, James, John, and Andrew.
So his inner circle.
His plus one.
Mm-hmm.
Because Andrew is not usually one with him. And
not when he's with the other 3 specifically. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry.
I knew what you meant. I'm just clarifying for the listeners.
But here we have 2 sets of brothers here. Mm-hmm. I thought that's interesting. before I go on, verses 5 through 13 might have a subtitle that says something like the sign of the times and the end of the age. And then 14 through 27 might have the great tribulation. When in all actuality, this is all one explanation. This is all one big explanation. He starts and ends this explanation with a warning. He says, take heed. So in verse 5, he says, take heed that no one deceives you. And then in verse 23, when it ends, he says, take heed. See, I have told you all things beforehand. So he leaves no room for guessing or wondering of what he's about to detail.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, and when you look at all four accounts, a lot of people get this all mixed up. And at the end of this this chapter, which we won't cover today, but if you go to the end of the chapter, it talks about Jesus' second coming. And a lot of people think that the signs that are talked about here apply to Jesus' second coming, and they don't.
Right.
They're completely separate. So we're not even going to get into that stuff today. But just in case you were expecting that, it's not what you think. Like you said, he bookends it. And so you can kind of tell right here, like, no, this is one completely different situation than what's talked about at the end of the chapter.
So the warnings he gives, if you look in verse 6, will be about deception, that it will happen, that people are going to come in his name, they're going to claim to be Christ, don't believe it. Galatians and Jude and 2 Peter 2 all talk about false teachers and false Christs. And so here's Jesus warning them, look, this is it. We have books or letters saying exactly that. And the next warning is in verse 7 when he says, there will be wars and rumors of wars. Such things must happen. And he tells them not to be troubled about it. Verse 8, he warns about the beginning of sorrows, the beginnings of persecutions of Christians. In verse 9, he warns about being delivered up to councils and beaten in the synagogues and brought before rulers and kings for his sake, for a testimony to them. And we read exactly that, all that happening in the book of Acts. And then in verse 10, he says why. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Matthew 28:19 and 20 is the Great Commission, go into all the world. And Acts 2, all nations are represented there. So he's saying, this is going to happen. So you're going to have all these things happen. You're still going to preach the gospel. Don't worry about if you get delivered up to the councils. And then he says in 11, but when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. This is New King James. But whatever is given you in that hour, speak that, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. In Acts, this happens with Peter, John, and Paul. They get brought up to kings and rulers, to Agrippa and Felix was with Paul, and Peter and John get thrown into prison a couple of times. Verse 12, now brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. A children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. So no Christian will escape persecution. I think it's pretty interesting that there are two sets of brothers here. And so they're probably thinking of their families. Brother will betray brother. So that's hitting close to home. It's probably trying to really emphasizing what he's saying.
Definitely possible.
And then in 13, he says, you will be hated by all men for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. So in the persecution, there's encouragement. There's hope for the faithful Christian. So he's sitting there telling them, look, there's this, and this is all going to happen. Yes, it's going to get bad. It's going to get really bad. But stay faithful. So he's still encouraging them. even though giving them the hard truths.
And you think about James and John. James was the first apostle to be martyred, and John was the last to die.
Yeah.
So all of that, I mean, you think about John and watching, I mean, knowing that his brother has died, and to live so long past that, I wonder if he thought back about this conversation and everything that Jesus says here, you know, and the one who endures to the end will be saved. Because, I mean, none of us really want to die. Like, none of us look forward to death itself. But to live out that long past all the people that you love, knowing what you're doing it for is so important. You know, and we live in a society where, I mean, people aren't being dragged out in the street and being murdered in the U.S. for being Christians. Yes, there's some persecution, I would say mild persecution in the States, but just having these kind of hard conversations or having this hard teaching, it wasn't a conversation. I'm sure at some point they responded. You would think they would.
That's got to be scary to hear.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, you mentioned James and John. Peter and Andrew were both crucified.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to what I said earlier about this not being about the end of the world and Jesus coming, those things that he was prophesying about, some of that was about, you know, the Holy Spirit instructing them on what to say. That doesn't happen anymore. No. We're in an age where that is past, you know, and I think about that passage in 1 Corinthians 13 where it talks about all the things that will cease, you know, and all those things have ceased. But we're still here.
Yep.
So if this happened in that time, and I mean, you go past that, past the context where we're going to be in today, verse 30, it says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So we know that's it right there, period, the end.
Yeah.
This is the context. But just a little side note, again, for all those who might have missed it the first time, I apparently care about this a great deal. This little note right here. Okay.
All right, so continuing on, starting at verse 14 through 23. This took me a long time to understand, and it wasn't until I really sat down and studied this part that I think I got it. But when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, I looked up Daniel, the prophecy that's being referred here. The abomination of desolation is that the prophet Daniel talked about is the destruction of the temple. It's an abomination that it was laid flat. So the standing where it ought not, this desolation personified by standing. And so, like, the temple's not there. It's the abomination of that. The temple was ruined, and it's not so much the temple as what it represents. The temple being destroyed is going to happen. It's not a figurative thing. And Jesus gives on some warnings about, you know, where you are. Hope that it's not winter time and stuff like that. He's giving them a hint, so to speak, giving them signs to say, look, when you see all this happening, yeah, it's time to get the kingdom borders expanded. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
What did you get out of it? Did you get the abomination?
Yes, I get that. I get that. I think I've always gotten lost in this passage. I don't know why. I mean,
well, it's not an easy read because we're not there to understand it for sure.
But basically, so the destruction of the temple kind of, in effect, pushes people outward.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Then I get it. It makes it not forces them, but it does. I mean, it forces them to fulfill what they're supposed to fulfill.
Right. So after all what he said in 5 through 13 happens in the book of Acts. That's basically the kingdom coming to the church, coming into coming into existence. And, the Great Commission was to go into all the world, correct?
Right.
Teaching all nations. Well, they didn't. They all stayed in Jerusalem. They all just stayed there.
Well, not all of them, though, because Acts tells us that they were scattered. Some of them were scattered, but, not all of them, but...
They weren't scattered until the destruction of the temple.
Like, none of them were scattered?
About 8,000 of them were not. Right? Because where does it say they scattered?
Well, the apostles, right?
The apostles stayed in Jerusalem, but they eventually left too. Historically, it doesn't say in the Bible, but other historians.
He was talking
Because
about
of
Saul.
Saul.
Yeah, Saul was going and dragging people
That's
out.
right. So, they were
So that's what I was thinking of.
persecuted.
And it might be a smaller number, but I can't say that all weren't scattered, that everyone stayed. Jesus says he prophesies of them receiving power. Would we say that for Acts 1:8? I don't know. But Jesus says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. So, and then later in Acts 8, it says that those who were scattered went abroad. Almost like the remnants were flushed out by the destruction. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
That's what I thought you were saying. Not to put words in your mouth. But some were scattered. It didn't say all were scattered. It said those who were scattered. I think we can both be right in this situation. Does that make sense? Or is it a no, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because...
Well, like I said, I didn't fully understand this studying it. But
I know. But it's always good to discuss it out. And if you go back to Acts 8, it says, there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So the apostles were not. But devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation. But Saul was ravaging the church. Sorry, and I'm not reading the whole verses here. I'm taking snippets. And it says he dragged people off and committed them to prison. And people were killed, of course.
So basically, Jesus in 15 through 18, he's telling them all these different scenarios. If you're on the housetop, don't come down. If you left something in your house, leave it there. If you're out in the field, don't come back. If you're pregnant, there's all these different scenarios. It's basically him saying, don't look back.
Oh, yeah, and I love 18. Pray that it may not happen in winter.
Ooh.
It's like he's piling it on. Like he's really emphasizing how bad it's going to be.
Yep. In 19, he said, in those days there will be tribulations such as has not been from the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. So it's going to be worse than when they were even in captivity.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be horrible.
And there will be nothing after it that will be as bad as it was.
And verse 20, and unless the Lord has shortened those days, no flesh will be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. He protects his own.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. It's encouraging still.
Oh, it is.
It's going to be the worst you've ever seen, but the Lord's going to protect you. 21 through 23 is the final warning he gives. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And this debunks the false teaching of once saved, always saved. Because Jesus here is saying they're going to try to even get you. Don't do it, because obviously it can be done.
You can be led astray. You can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, verse 23, he ended it with a warning that says, I've told you all these things beforehand. There's no excuse.
The only thing of note that I had is completely different.
Of course.
You know me. Gotta make it interesting. I was geeking out over the Mount of Olives.
Oh, yeah?
Because it mentions at the very beginning of the passage. And as he sat out on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, and he was talking with them privately there, like, I don't know why, like I said, like some things just sometimes they hit me. And I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I know I've heard some stuff about the Mount of Olives, but how significant it is and how much it has seen just, I mean, period, but I mean, especially with Jesus. Luke 22:39 talks about it being his custom to be on the Mount of Olives, but his triumphal entry happened on the Mount of Olives, started on the Mount of Olives. And you can find that in Luke 19:28-40, because it talks about him coming back into the city from the Mount of Olivet. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the wording there.
Even Mark 11:1.
And at the end of that, he's weeping over the city as he's on the mount. And then we see him as well in Mark 14, which we haven't gotten to yet. We'll get there. 32-50, his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane was on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. And his betrayal happened there. His arrest happened there. He healed Malchus's ear there. And then his final act, his ascension, happened there. And I just thought about like how much, like we talk, I know you normally geek out over the geography, and I don't know how, I mean, it was a fairly, I mean, there's 3 peaks, I think, for the Mount of Olives. But I mean, it's a substantial amount of square footage or acreage or whatever you would call it. I don't know those words. But I was just thinking about how so much happened there. And this is like he's pausing here, as was his custom. So this was just another everyday thing for him. But like the implications of this conversation are huge. They are massive. And it made me think about our own lives, like sitting on the couch with the kids. And that's an everyday task, and it is our custom. But the implications of the conversations that we have there are huge if we let them be. It's all, teachable moments. But anyway, that's where my mind went from that, which is completely different from the abomination of desolation.
Just a little.
Yeah, just a little.
So verses 24-27 might be subtitled Coming of the Son of Man. If you read it and keep everything in context, verse 24 says, after the tribulation. So after the tribulation, it doesn't say how long after, but only that he's returning and that there will be signs. So notice how, though, he spent more time explaining their more immediate hurdle, which is persecution and the destruction of their way of life and worship. So Jerusalem will no longer be God's city. There's a new Jerusalem, which would be the church. And you can read a little bit more about that in Revelation 21:9-27.
Yeah, and there's a whole book written to people that would struggle with that in Hebrews, to all those who, and I often wonder, I wonder how much harder it would be for those who had converted out of Judaism into Christianity if the temple was still standing. And, because they made the pilgrimage to the temple.
Yeah, that's true.
And they were obviously, we have Hebrews, they were obviously struggling, holding on to what was before.
And they valued not just the temple, but their genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where the genealogy would have been kept, but it doesn't matter. All of Jerusalem was destroyed.
Yeah.
And all the records was destroyed too. So, like you said, it
makes me think about like those movies with Tom Hanks.
Which one?
Do you know which ones I'm talking about?
No.
Oh, they're based off the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons.
I didn't see that.
And all that stuff. It's a bunch of really out there weird stuff about Jesus's lineage and stuff. It makes me think about that.
All right. Well, now we're at our usual question. Where do you find the love of Christ?
I think we're going to find it in the same place this time.
You think?
At least in the same chunk of scriptures, but specifically for me, I think it's verse 19. because that is so scary, but at the same time so comforting, where it talks about, for in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. And so for me, there's comfort that, the worst that it ever has been has already happened. No matter what I live through, it doesn't always make it better, but it makes it easier to know that there's comfort, for me at least. I mean, we say it literally, it could be worse. It always could be worse, but it definitely, we're told here, it definitely could be worse because the worst has already happened, or at this point it's going to happen, but for us it's already happened.
Yeah. I kind of saw it the same way. I saw it in the same principle. I saw it in his willingness to tell them all things beforehand. Like, he does not want his people to perish, like 2 Peter 3:9 says. He warned them and he warns us of the dangers, but offers protection.
Yeah.
So that's where I saw it. So it's kind of that, but kind of not.
Yeah. It's close. It's closer than it usually is.
Right, yeah. He offers hope.
Yes, he does. All right, well, that does it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to email us with the new email that we've mentioned in the last couple of episodes, or get in touch with us on social media. We try to monitor those pretty closely. We'd love to study with you if you're local or connect you to someone local to you. Really, that's what we're here for. That's what we're wanting to do with this. As always, we hope you'll seek to know the love of Christ in your own lives. Until next time.
You can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. And be sure to click like and share this episode with family and friends. In doing so, you're sharing the love of Christ.